Welcome to the Sports Ethicist Show, coming to you from the basement of Burpee on the campus of Rockford University in Sportstown, USA, Rockford, Illinois. I am Shawn Klein, the Sports Ethicist. The Sports Ethicist Show discusses the many ethical and philosophical issues that arise in and around sport. You can read the Sports Ethicist blog at sportsethicist.com, where you can also download pictures of previous shows, subscribe to the podcast, or find links to related information. The Sports Ethicist is also on Facebook and Twitter. You can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. Now, for many, this is the playoff time in fantasy football. And by many, I'm talking about millions of people. Millions of people fretting over their lineups, debating, deliberating over which wide receivers to start. Fantasy sports have been around for 30 or more years in some fashion or another and have grown exponentially. What started as something like the sport version of Dungeons & Dragons is now a huge part of the overall sport industry, generating billions of dollars in revenue. With the large number of participants and money involved, fantasy sports beg for analysis. So to talk about some of the ethical and philosophical issues in fantasy sports, I've asked Chad Carlson to come on the show. Chad Carlson is an assistant professor at Eastern Illinois University, where he focuses on the socio-cultural aspects of sport, with specific focus on historical and philosophical issues related to race, religion, and policy. Also the history and philosophy of play and games. Chad was last on the show last spring as part of the Rockford Sports Symposium. All right, welcome back to the show, Chad. Now,
thanks.
Sure. It's a little colder out than the last time you were here on the show, although you're not here in person today, which I'm sure you're happy of, not having to go outdoors.
Okay, yeah. It's been a horrible day there. That's the nature of being at the end of football season, I guess.
Yeah. So now I've asked you on the show today to talk about your recent article in the Journal of the Philosophy of Sport. The article is The Reality of Fantasy Sports, a Metaphysical and Ethical Analysis. And so this is obviously big-time fantasy football playoffs and so on, so it seemed like the right time to have this conversation. So I was hoping you could summarize the article briefly, or at least give maybe some comments on some of the main points of the article.
Sure, I can. I think it's good timing that the article came out during football season as well. That was sort of serendipitous more than anything. I would have liked to have lobbied for that, or at least to be able to say I lobbied for it, but that just wasn't the case.
It's just fortuitous.
Pure luck.
Yeah.
Pure luck. Yeah, fortuitous. So I'm happy that it came out during football season. I think that's an especially important time right now at the end of the football season, end of the regular season, where we have fantasy playoffs right now. Anyways, this article spawned from just my experiences playing fantasy football and struggling a little bit with my football fanship. That is my rooting for the Chicago Bears, so to speak, and my interest in my fantasy team doing well. And I found myself at odds a number of times where I'd be watching games on a Sunday and thinking, boy, I really want certain things to happen right now that go against everything that players strive to do in football. And so there are certain times, and boy, on a third down, I'm hoping that maybe the team that has the ball is not going to do well, or is going to do well, and that would be, or I'm hoping for only a short gain on first down, which just didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So I just thought I'd delve into a little bit more of the metaphysics of fantasy football and how that sort of changes our spectatorship of fantasy, or football overall. And so the article is basically, I start off by describing fantasy sports in the context of play, that is autotelic or intrinsically motivated behavior, and then talk about the way in which fantasy sports are games in the traditional sense of a game, and then go into just a real shallow analysis of what fantasy sports does to us and the way we watch sports, especially fantasy football. So looking at the differences in how we watch the game when we're fantasy owners versus when we're just partisan fans of a particular team, and then looking at what we are hoping for and how that changes our understanding of the game when we become fantasy owners. So fantasy football is such a popular game now in the United States that we've really come to understand a game based on fantasy statistics or those football statistics that are important in fantasy. And so we've become very comfortable talking about the statistics of quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, tight ends, kickers, and defenses. But what we lose then is the understanding of the subtleties of the game of football that makes it what it is, or that has made it what it is over time, and that is the teamwork, the intangibles, making a good block on the outside.
Okay.
Defense, being able to put pressure or close certain gaps on the line that allows the offense, or that doesn't allow the offense to score much. And so I think at the end of the day then, in this article, what I'm trying to do is get sports philosophers to start discussing fantasy sports, number one, from a philosophical context, and number two, for sort of the general fan or the layperson to really put in context what their fantasy ownership does to football, to society, and to sports in general, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's a great article. I'll put up a link to it. I don't know
Sure.
if how much access people have to it in terms of any kind of paywall or anything, but
Yeah.
there's ways around that at times. But so it's certainly if you're a college student or at a campus, you probably can get access through the library for sure. So it's a great article, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to bring you on the show to talk about it, and then also just some of the points that you were raising, just in your summary of it, I think are key. I mean, one of the things that conversations I've had with some friends of mine who are, really hardcore football fans, watch a lot of football, and, comes around fantasy time, and you're like, hey, come join my league, come get in my league. You know a lot about football, let's go. And they show no interest. And so I've asked them, why not? It's not that it's necessarily for everybody, and that if you're a football fan, you have to be playing fantasy, but I was just curious. And
Sure.
one of there's the two main responses that I get from those folks are things that you covered, in your paper as well as, in your summary. One is the idea of conflict of interest, right, so to speak, of the fan, as you were talking about, where you have a fantasy player and that maybe is on the team that you root for, as you the Bears, Patriots fan, and so I actually had that conflict last week. I had actually ended up not playing him. In part because of this conflict, but I also thought matchups, it might not work out, although I was wrong. So, Josh Brown, is that the Cleveland receiver? I think that's his name, Josh Brown, right?
Yeah. Sure.
And so they were playing the Patriots, and so I was conflicted because, well, okay, if I play him, I'm going to want him to do well, but if he does well, that's not good for my Patriots. So there's this conflict there. I ended up not playing him because I figured Talib, who's the top cornerback for the Patriots, would be on him and that it would limit him. I was wrong, but so I did try to make it in terms of an actual matchup decision, not just my fandom. Although I do that, and certainly in drafting, I don't know if I've mentioned this to you before, but I think I've mentioned it before on the podcast, because we've had one or two other podcasts where we've talked about fantasy, and I never draft any Jets players. Now, this year it was easy because there weren't any Jets players to draft. But, in previous years, that's sometimes been a struggle. And I really, if there's a good player, I'll sometimes pass on that player, even though they're available at the draft, because I don't want to root for anybody on the Jets because of my fandom for the Patriots. And then also just in general, I don't like the Jets. So and then even certain particular players, that I just don't want to root for whatever reasons. A couple years ago, when Mike Vick came back, and I still see that some people refuse to take Vick even when he's available because of his past. And so you do see that. And so I think that's one reason that people give, is that they don't want to put themselves into a conflict of interest position between their team and their fantasy team. And then the other one, which I think is less common, but is in some ways I think more important, is the fact of the overemphasis on the offensive side because of the statistics on the offensive side of scoring and yards earned. That's the main way in which fantasy football is played, that it leaves out significant and important parts of the game. as you mentioned, some of the defensive or special teams, but then also even on the offensive side, as you mentioned, a good block, right? So, I mean, a lot of the importance of a good tight end is not just to have some guy who can go and catch balls and, run great routes like a Rob Gronkowski or Jimmy Graham, but also someone who can put on a block and be important in the running game or be important in protection for the pass game. And, that's not captured in the statistics, and which is why tight ends aren't usually an important player or as important of a player to draft when you're thinking. I mean, after there's like 3 or 4 guys, Jimmy Graham and Rob Gronkowski and Gonzalez a couple years ago. He's fallen off a little bit, so there's always been a couple guys, but after that, it's a big drop off, and that's because there's no statistics for a tight end and a lot of what they do on the field, which is extremely important to football, but not so much to fantasy. And so that difference in the nature of the game there, I think, is important and is missed in fantasy. And that's one reason why I've talked to some fans where they say they don't like fantasy because it does miss out on those important parts of the game. I guess
think that's important. Those are real complaints that people have, and you have the purists that you mentioned at the end, the people that actually care about things in football outside of just the statistics. But boy, I tell you, the majority of people who are football fans seem to be interested, at least in my experiences, in playing fantasy. Mm-hmm. But there's the difficulties there, and so I can remember being in early leagues, and this was in the pre-Calvin Johnson era, and I'm from Michigan, where boy, I knew that there were 2 or 3 guys in my league that were just suckers for Lions fans.
Yes.
And would always draft them with the hope that they'd actually have a good season, and they never did. And so that I was able to use that to my benefit. But I think there's that type of shallow partisan fan who goes a little bit too hardcore in drafting players from their team. And then there's what you talked about, the seemingly deep fantasy player who is willing to take a hit by not drafting opponents or of the rival or players in the rival team from your team.
Yeah.
So there's a difference there, but I think that really complicates matters. And I would say that at the end of the day, fantasy owners will put their fantasy team in the second priority to rooting for their partisan team, that is their real team. I think that tends to be the case for the most part. That's just a descriptive claim that I have. I just find that most football fans are football fans first, even though they love their ownership and love playing fantasy. They would love to see their team win the Super Bowl. And I think if it comes down to winning the fantasy league or their team winning the actual Super Bowl, unless there's a ton of money in the fantasy league, I think that's if all things are equal, I would say that the football fanship might take precedent.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, certainly speaking personally, for me, there's no question that fantasy is a second. I like it. It's a lot of fun, but it's, I'd rather get shellacked in fantasy and go and never win a game and have the Patriots win every week than the other way around, for sure. And certainly I'll look and I'll see, well, if the Patriots have a good game, that might mean, because I do tend not to draft too many Patriots players. Or at least I try not to, because there's a natural, some of it is there's just a natural bias towards your own team. One, you can root for those players and you don't have to worry about the conflict, if you have your team, your partisan team on your fantasy team, then you don't have to worry about the conflict.
Right.
You sort of double down on that, which can be, I've done that in the past where my team has been made up a lot of Patriot players, and then of course when the Patriots lose, and then you look at your fantasy and then they lose, and it sort of doubles down. But it's nice the other way too. But but you just tend to know your team better, and so you tend to overvalue a wide receiver or running back on your team, knowing that, oh, well, he's good and he does this and he does that. But then, through the season, it's just not going to work out in terms of a fantasy player, even though they might be very important for your team, a third down back type of running back.
Sure, sure.
And so I do try to avoid doing that because I don't want to, just in terms of trying to correct that bias. But yeah, certainly it's for me, the fantasy is a second priority, and it's explicit to me. So it's not something that I just kind of go week to week and just kind of feel through and then always just sort of my team wins out. But it's when I sit down to do the fantasy and I think about drafting, and I think week to week matchups, it's important to me, that I don't put myself into a position that I'd ever be rooting against, the Patriots.
Right. And they say that you should, when you're gambling, that you should gamble with your head and not with your heart, right? You should never gamble on or against your team.
Right.
Because your heart's too into it. And fantasy sports is gambling in many ways, and so it's the same thing applies. I agree with what you're saying. For me, the difficulty that I've had, it hasn't been as difficult being a Bears fan. The offense just has not been that good, for the last 10, 15 years, aside from when Jay Cutler's come. But, when say, I had a strong Bears tight end, let's say, I'm blanking on his name. I think he's down in maybe Miami now or New Orleans or something like that, but anyways, when I had him on my team, what I was hoping for then, if the Bears got in the red zone, was that they'd get into a third down situations where there'd be a better chance of them throwing, say, a play-action pass to the tight end, as opposed to, trying to run it in for a touchdown. And so the conflict there was very real. I wanted the Bears to score, but I cared how it happened.
Right.
And to me, there were some issues there. And now I'm not as strong of a Bears fan as you are with the Patriots. And so I think there were times when I thought, man, I really need to win my fantasy, and let's just put that ahead just for now, just for now, just to get through this week. But there were some real difficulties there, and different things I was rooting for that seemed antithetical to football, and seemed like I had to make a decision one way or another, and relegate one game down to deprioritization.
Yeah,
it was not easy to do.
I've definitely been in that situation where the Patriots have scored. And they've scored with the quote unquote wrong guy. It's like, well, why couldn't you have thrown it to Ridley instead of this? Then I would have gotten these points. But it's a sort of I'm happy anyway. I know I'm sort of in a way I'm sort of laughing at myself when I'm doing that. I don't really take it too seriously at that point. I'm happy that the Patriots scored. I would have been maybe happier if they had thrown it to the guy I had. But I'm still happy when they score. But yeah, it does. You do end up rooting for weird things when you're in fantasy.
I just have you end up rooting for weird things. Now I think that there's a positive side to that. You're thinking about the game in a different way, and you're really starting to understand certain things better. So let me give an example. Let's see, I'm a Penn State grad, and so a fellow Penn State grad who was in the NFL for a few years, Larry Johnson, had a couple of good seasons. And then all of a sudden, he really fell off the map. I mean, he was a top 3 to 5 running back for a couple of years there in terms of fantasy points. And then he all of a sudden falls off.
Right.
And so we're trying to figure out, why did that happen? What was the reason for that? And really what it came down to was the Chiefs had traded their fullback. And this was a lead blocker that was well known among NFL players as being the number one fullback in the league. I can't even think of the guy's name because, boy, he didn't score any fantasy points ever. But he was a terrific lead blocker. Larry Johnson loses him, and all of a sudden sort of falls off the map. And so we maybe, as fantasy owners, we get a chance to think about some of the nuances of those aspects of football, which can be good. At the same time, we are oftentimes rooting for a short game, first and second down, so we get in a passing situation if we have a receiver on the team. Or something unique like that. I remember I had Ben Roethlisberger one year, and, the Steelers at the time would throw a lot early to set up their running game to salt the game away later. And I needed Ben to throw a lot. And so what I was hoping for is during the first quarter and even the second quarter, that they maybe wouldn't score all that much, that they wouldn't do very well, so that he had a better chance of throwing more in the second half as opposed to pounding it with Mendenhall or whoever else.
Right.
And that to me just seemed, boy, what am I even doing? And it's like you said, I was laughing at myself. What am I doing watching this game?
Right. Yeah, I know, and that's one of the weird things that you root for. You sort of root sometimes for them to score. You want them to score a lot of points. Like, let's say, you have Roethlisberger. You want them to score a lot of points, but you don't want them to do it too early or maybe even too much because you don't want a second stringer to come in, or you don't want them to stop throwing and just ice the game running it. And so you get into these really weird sort of scenarios that you're rooting for in game. But I think, you do point out, and you pointed out in the article, the education engagement role of fantasy, that in order to do well at fantasy and to play it well and to really get into it, you have you have to educate yourself about the sport. And so, certainly when it comes time to drafting, you have to pay attention to all aspects of the player's game, right? So here you might have someone, well, this guy puts up a lot of points, but you need to consider, okay, well, why is he putting up those points? Is it because they're down a lot? Is that more of a fluky situation, or are they going to be playing better defenses this year so that they're not going to have an opportunity to come back? Or thinking about, okay, this player, like the Larry Johnson situation, here's a player who's a great running back, but he's lost his fullback, or they've changed the quarterback, or they have a different offensive coordinator who likes to throw the ball more. And so the level of knowledge about the sport, both in terms of the skill sets of the sport and just what's going on, who's where, who's on what team, is really, there's a deep amount of knowledge to gain there, and does enhance your whole overall understanding of the game beyond just your team. Because for the most part, if you're a partisan fan, and most fans I think are, you know about your team, you know the coaches on your team probably, and or at least some of them, and you know the players and the fullback, and you might know, oh, well, this guy's going to have a rougher season because he's lost his fullback or whatnot, right? Or this different receiver is there, and so he's going to get more touches now than the other guy, and so you'll know that about your own team going in, independent of fantasy. But you're not going to know that about the other teams. Maybe you know it about your rival, right? But you're not going to know it about. So I follow the AFC East. I might know a little bit more about the Jets and the Dolphins and so on. But the Chargers or the Seahawks or something, I know very little about them outside of. I just don't have the time to follow it as if I was a football commentator on ESPN or something like that, where I could watch all the games. I can't do that. But so one of the things that I like about fantasy is that it is an in to learn what's going on and to keep track and be more aware of what's going on across the league. And so then just in terms of my regular fandom, when it comes time to fantasy, or when it comes time to playing the Cleveland Browns, okay, the Cleveland Browns aren't good. The Patriots are going to beat them handily. I was worried because I knew that Josh Brown was a wide receiver who, even though he doesn't really have a good quarterback, was getting lots of touches and lots of big yards. And I know that the Patriots defense gives that up. And I know that because of fantasy.
Right. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, that's certainly the case. And I think that makes it fun. That there's a fun element there. That this is play for us. We choose how we're going to spend our leisure time, and this is one of the ways that we seem to enjoy doing that. The other thing I think is that, fantasy sports is, although I've talked about it being gambling, and I'll get into that here in a minute, it's also somewhat meritorious. I think it seems to me that at least to an extent, the more time that you put in, the better capabilities you have of putting a good team out on the field. Now, you can't dictate how your players play. You can't dictate whether they get injured during the game. You can't dictate the coach's game plan and the play calling.
Right.
But the more time you spend understanding the matchups, understanding, for instance, who's covering your wide receiver, that sort of thing, will help, I think, in large part.
And knowing different tendencies of coaches. So, for example, like the Shanahan teams, the way he uses his running backs makes it not very fortuitous for fantasy players, because he'll often have a running back who puts up a lot of yards, but that's not the guy who puts the ball in the end zone. In a lot of his, just looking historically at the way Shanahan has run his teams, and so that's or he often has more of a I don't want to say committee, but he'll have a few guys, and so it splits up that. So knowing that will help you in terms of whether or not you want to take Alfred Morris with your first pick, or maybe wait to see if he hangs around a little bit later. So
absolutely, I think that's very important. I think that's one of the reasons why it has taken so well with men in the United States. Especially those who watch football tend to be a little bit more competitive anyway, and so we want to engage in this football-like game, and we do that. But we also want to know that we have some bearing on the outcome of our game, which is fantasy football, not football. But we have some bearing on our game. And I think that speaks to a lot of people, and maybe part of the reason why it's so popular. Peter Hostiker. Peter is a sport philosopher at Penn State Altoona. and he has done a little research on this over the past couple of years. Really, I've sort of goaded him into it, I think, in a sense. But he's a hardcore fantasy player, and he has spent some time. So 2 seasons ago, he decided he was going to do a little research project, and in his league, he drafted only Giants, which is his favorite team, or Steelers, the local team, and just wanted to see how it went in terms of spectatorship and how that would fit with his ability to be a fantasy owner.
Okay.
Now this past season, he has spent some time with a different type of research agenda. And what he's doing right now is he has one league where he just did the computer draft and has let the computer line things up for him, and then the other one he's actually done the work. And he just wanted to make sure that a human would do better than, say, for instance, a computer. And I think we think this would be the case, but certainly it worked out that way for him. And so it was, I think, reassuring to fantasy football fans, I guess, if you were to promote the research project he's done, that yes, a human spending time at it should do better than a computer that would just line up your top. Position.
Now, did he just did the auto draft?
He did the auto draft, and that was based out of necessity. He could not make the draft, so he had to do the auto draft for that one, and then just decided, hey, since I'm in 2 leagues, why don't I just have that be the control group, the computer, and then I will spend time on my other team and see what happens.
Well, I do wonder if you set up the auto draft a little bit differently and had maybe at least some rudimentary AI, because one of the things that you sometimes see with the auto draft is, because it tends to, depending on how it's set up, might just take the highest ranked player. And so, but you might be in a 1 quarterback league and end up with 4 quarterbacks and not have a kicker.
Right.
And so kind of screw yourself. And whereas I think if you had an auto draft with some intelligence, it would recognize, okay, well, we have 2 quarterbacks. We're going to skip over any remaining quarterbacks, and take somebody else, right? And so if you had something with a little bit of an algorithm behind it, that I would be interested to see if that would do better. I actually think a human would do better than your standard auto draft, and I've seen that in various leagues. Sometimes someone will get lucky just depending on where their picks are, and they'll end up with, because there are certain guys, I mean, like, so for instance, if you just lucked out this year and somehow, you got Peyton Manning, in your fantasy league, then you're probably going to win your fantasy league this year, right? Unless you
he's not good.
Yeah. So and then a couple years ago, it was Adrian Peterson, right? And so that if you have someone like that, you're probably going to win no matter what happens. But, I think, across, many sample sizes, I bet a human does beat, the standard auto draft. I'm more skeptical if you had actually some intelligence behind the auto draft. Now, again, this is just my speculation there. Just because I think it would take any of the emotional attachments out that someone might have towards or against a player or a team. So, oh, well, I can't take that guy. I just can't root for him, or you might undervalue or overvalue someone just because of your own biases, because of your own, so if you're a Giants fan, you're just going to be more attuned to the stuff that's going on in the NFC East, and so you're going to overvalue or undervalue things that are there. And so it may not even be out of emotion, just out of bias, whereas a computer is just going to have the statistics there and the projected stats, and that's what they'll use. So that'd be an interesting study, and I wonder if anyone's actually done that.
I wonder about that too. I gotta believe with how popular fantasy is that someone's thinking about that. But the leagues, the online leagues, are getting more and more complex over time, and so I would imagine that. I know that with the auto draft, I'm not sure exactly how Peter did it, but I know that he had a roster that he could play with after the draft, and I think he had set it up in a certain way that it would draft, I don't know, first few rounds, but then the commissioner of the league would ensure that he had enough players to cover every position, and he did. And then there came up some issues where, bye week, well, what do I do? A computer will not insert one of my subs during a bye week, and I think that he let that go for the sake of consistency.
Oh, so he did it through the whole season?
Yes, the whole season.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really interesting.
the entire season, and so he's been sending me updates every week, and he did not make the playoffs in his auto draft computer league.
Yeah.
But he did make the playoffs. He squeaked in his human league, or the one that he actually participated in, where he actually showed some agency.
Right.
And I think it was maybe a 3 or 4 game swing. And I love Peter, but he has struggled in fantasy over the years, and so I think that 4 game difference is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's in a pretty good league too, where he has people that spend a lot of time on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I play with some guys who are pretty good. No one who's as intense as what you might see on like FX's The League or anything like that. Do you watch that show? Have you seen that show?
Yeah.
No one it's not quite as intense as that, but they know what they're doing for the most part. We don't have any. Well, in one league, it's a bigger league. I think we have 14 teams, which is far too big, I think, actually. And then we have to play 4 wide receivers. So, I mean, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel sometimes. But again, in some ways that's good because you learn about the secondary players a lot more, than I would otherwise. But, right. So, there's I don't think there's really any what I call zombie teams there that are just kind of coasting through and not doing anything, or teams that are just dumping players and engaging in bad trades or anything like that. So for the most part, people are active, and playing the game, and so that's been good. And in one league, I'm in first place, and in the other, I'm in second, which is I'm pretty happy about, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's been a little bit of smoke and mirrors, I think. I think I'm probably going to end up, my first place league, we had our playoffs start last week, but I had a bye, which was kind of lame in fantasy. I don't really need a bye in fantasy.
Right.
I didn't need the rest. But, but so this week, I think I'm going to end up losing, this week. I think the matchup just isn't going to work out in my favor. But in my other league, it's pretty close, and I'm playing a good friend of mine, and head to head. So that should be pretty fun. And I think we each so Cincinnati and Pittsburgh are playing this weekend, correct? Am I right about that? And I have Andy Dalton, and he has Ben Roethlisberger. So it's even that much more of a head to head. So we'll see what happens there, but that league is because the bigger league, the one I'm in first in, I only know some of the folks. It's really a distance league where people all over the country kind of grew out of graduate school. This league is all guys that are here at Rockford, and so it's a lot more fun, and it'll be a lot more savory if I win.
Sure, absolutely.
Although I think there'll be some suspicion because I'm the commissioner, but
that's right. That should be the case. It should give you a hard time, shouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's Matthew Berry, who wrote the Fantasy Life book, which is a great book about fantasy. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that. It's a quick read. It's a lot of fun. Just a lot of different stories about how fantasy has affected people's lives, and particularly his own. And he talks about how, one of the goals of fantasy is just to show up your friends, show them how much more you know about football than they do.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I think that's the case.
Yeah. Which is why, coming back to one of the drawbacks in terms of, and we've talked about this, in person before, in terms of trying to develop metrics for things like the tight end block, for things like, a player, or special teams, including more of those kind of statistics, and have them as more of an explicit part of fantasy, because to know that would require you to know a lot more about the teams. Whereas, anybody who at least pays attention somewhat to the NFL, watches ESPN on occasion, would know to take Peyton Manning or Adrian Peterson in their draft. But to know who's a good blocking tight end, that's a level of football geekdom that I think would be fun to try to test out in the sphere of fantasy, because you'd have to know a lot more.
I agree. Quarterbacks have always been given too much credit for wins and too much blame for losses. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just because we can quantify their statistics. We quantify running back statistics for the most part. we don't know much about the blocking of some of these guys that are getting 25 to 30 carries a game.
Right.
We know receivers, but there's a difficulty there, and I think football coaches do what they can to try to quantify, what makes a player valuable and good to a team, especially one that's not in a offensive skill position. Mm-hmm. And yet, it's so difficult to do that. Number one, for them to be able to figure out who they should have on their actual football team, but then to translate that into fantasy ownership. I think that would be a terrific thing for the game if we could take a look at pancake blocks or something like that. It would be terrific, I think, for the game of football. We are a statistics-oriented sports culture in the U.S., that's for sure, and we thrive on this stuff. And so I think we would eat up any of these new metrics that could be developed.
Now, what about including penalties? So if a guy gets tagged for pass interference, having that count against your points, in the same way that fumbles might.
Yeah. Well, I agree. All these things that would if we could make it as close to football as possible, or anything you do to hurt your team should be counted against you. Anything you do to help your team should be counted for you. Mm-hmm. And we could probably figure that out, fairly accurately. But there's certainly some defensive positions where offenses are just avoiding certain players. And so you think about Darrelle Revis and Revis Island. How do we quantify how good he is from game to game?
Right.
The teams aren't even, if they don't throw at him, he can't generate any statistics. And who knows if teams aren't throwing at him because he's good, or they're not throwing at him because they found other weaknesses in the defense, or have just found strengths in their offense going in a different direction. So there's some difficulties there, but I think those are the types of discussions that we have to have in terms of how can we make fantasy as helpful. Let me add a caveat here. If the NFL wants to continue to generate, I think, interest in fantasy football for the good of football, professional football, you would think that they'd be interested then in spending some time trying to influence or lobby the fantasy organizers to try to figure out ways in which they can continually increase interest in that, but also do that in a way that is helpful for football, for the NFL. I think right now, I'm not sure what the NFL's thoughts are. Clearly, any interest in the NFL is good interest for them. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there have been some social trends or some cultural changes that have been affected, I think, in part by fantasy interest in players, getting theirs, so to speak, getting their touches, getting their statistics, and there's this cultural capital, I think, for someone who is, say, the most sought-after quarterback, running back, or wide receiver on a fantasy team. And so there's that's created, I think, some individualism that probably was there beforehand, but has maybe increased it in a sense. And you worry about the long-term effects of something like that within the game of football, which has become more and more individualized over the years anyways. A player, after he makes a good play, he's making a 15-second commercial about himself by dancing and by doing his first down point or whatever it might be. And so you wonder where that might go over time. Certainly fantasy doesn't seem to be going away. In fact, it's getting more popular. But what would happen in the future? Where should the NFL step in, or should it at all? I don't know.
It does seem like the NFL is more reacting to fantasy than leading it. And I think
I agree with that.
That's the case in all the sports. And fantasy grew out of grassroots kind of thing where just some people together in a basement, basically. I think of it as sort of the sports versions of Dungeons and Dragons, and and it's so it grows out of that, and then the league's just kind of like, wow, there's a lot of interest here. We need to tap into it. So it'd be interesting to see if they do try to influence it in some way, or encourage it in a positive way. I do think in the end it's going to come from the fantasy players themselves, looking at the league, and thinking, well, because you can tweak the rules, you can, have different versions of the game, and so how these, because I mean, between the two leagues I'm in, there's different point values for things. I mean, I'll have, Vincent Jackson playing in both my leagues, and he gets different points. in the same week. And so there's definitely some differences in terms of how the points are calculated. And so you can include different things in that. And I think if we're going to start including these other non-offensive or point scoring or point connected type of statistics, and move to the things like the blocking, like other kinds of statistics that we could measure. How do you measure the Darrell Revis Island type thing? And, having people, just in the way it's always developed, having people come up with a metric that would do that, and then it will get tweaked over time, and then when you have that and it gets popular, and if enough people are interested in it, I think it will develop. My sense is it's not going to come from the league, but I think the league has been influenced by it, as you said. I mean, the players. I think that's as you said, long been part of contemporary football, just to get your face out there, so you do the dance and so on, and it does get you more media attention, and so you get your name out there as opposed to someone who's going to be more nondescript. But
it's an entertainment league, anyways.
Yeah.
It's an entertainment league, and so anytime that players can promote themselves, I think there's an interest for the NFL to allow that to happen, at least.
Definitely, yeah. And
so that's important to the game.
And fans like that. I mean, the fans.
Yeah.
You don't like it when the other team celebrates, but when your guy celebrates, you're like, all right, that's great. Yeah, we should be allowed to have fun in this. When the other team does it, you're like, you should throw a flag. That's unsportsmanlike.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right. But one of the things that the NFL has done that's made it a little bit more difficult on fantasy leagues has been this Thursday night game every week now.
Yeah.
And whereas beforehand, outside of Thanksgiving week and the first week of the season, you had from Tuesday morning all the way to Sunday morning, really, to set your lineup. And now that's been cut in half, at least, especially if you have a team playing a Thursday night game where they change things. And I think the NFL has said, we don't really, hey, whatever, you do whatever you want with fantasy football, but this is what's best for us and our TV ratings. People are watching anyways, whether they're playing fantasy or not, so we don't,
right.
Clearly not a priority for us.
Right, no, that's true. And frankly, I don't know why people are watching Thursday night games. They're atrocious. But, I do not like Thursday night. Thanksgiving is great. Maybe have a couple at the end of the season, or the other way, is a little off topic, but I think, if you're going to have Thursday night games, I think the teams that play on Thursday night have to have, they should be coming out of a bye week, so that they have time to get healthy, to be prepared, and to travel. Because, if you play a late Sunday night game, you basically have like 1 day of practice, if you have to travel to go play somewhere. And I just think that puts you at a competitive disadvantage, particularly for the team that's home, that doesn't have to travel. So,
I absolutely agree.
I wanted to come back to one of the points. I'm trying to remember what it was. One of the other points that I wanted to come back to was the gambling. So you said you were going to talk a little bit more, and that was something that you talked a lot about in the article as well. The connection, relationship, or parallel between gambling and fantasy. So was there more you wanted to say about that?
Yeah. Thanks for getting back to that. I think when we try to look at the landscape of our sports and games, we can draw some lines in the sand, I suppose, and we could look at this from different, metaphysical camps, I suppose. But, basically, when we play sports, when we participate in sports, we understand that our agency plays a big part in whether we win or lose. Clearly, we understand that luck is involved at times. A bad bounce, the ball goes off someone, this or that, something happens that without your control. We understand that. And certain sports are more susceptible to luck elements. Things such as outdoor sports, downhill ski racing, right? The conditions of the snow could change from 1 minute to the next, or short track speed skating, where, Paolo Antonello can just happen to fall behind, fall and knock out racers behind him that had no agency in that. Mm-hmm. We understand those things happen.
Right, or the soccer ball hitting the goalpost, and it just...
Exactly, the round goalpost hitting, the round ball hitting the round goalpost, and you just don't know what's going to happen with that. However, we want to believe, I think, that at the end of the game or event, that our merit has played a large part in how the game has ended, the outcome. And we understand how much luck is involved there. In gambling, I think what we're doing, we're playing games. These gambling activities are games. And so I think we're going into those expecting that more of it is out of our hands than what we're traditionally used to in our sport.
Right.
And we understand that when we play games. And fantasy is that way. Now, I tried to make a connection between playing fantasy sports, fantasy football specifically, and playing, say, poker. Both of those have large elements of luck, but also elements of skill, agency, merit that will affect the outcome, so to speak. What happens is the difference, though, between the two, I think, is important. If you're playing poker, you are dealt a hand randomly. You have no determination over what cards you get. From there, your agency kicks in and you play the game. Fantasy is the opposite, where you spend all kinds of time setting your lineup, and you dictate who you're going to play based on your roster and matchups and that sort of thing. But then once the games start, your agency is done. And you're just watching, and it's in many cases luck. And so I think when we talk about gambling, and in many states, there's been discussion based on whether they should allow fantasy sports or not officially because it might be considered gambling. Mm-hmm. I think we need to make a line in the sand saying it is clearly different from playing the slot machine. Right. It's clearly different from just placing $100 on the Patriots with 7 points. There's an element of skill there, and I think we need to take that into account, much like we should with poker. And because we play poker at casinos or within gambling establishments, we lump that in with every other type of gambling there. Mm-hmm. And I think when we're going to talk about fantasy football as gambling, we need to make sure we understand that there is probably more merit there, more skill involved there than there is for a lot of gambling activities that we engage in. Not roulette. It's not the slots.
Right.
It's more like poker. Mm-hmm. And we have a world championship of poker because there is some skill there. And so I think that makes a difference to us, I think, in how we understand fantasy football in the context of overall games, sports in our society.
Yeah, and I like the distinction that you draw between the setup and the playing out, mm-hmm. and how the gambling element between poker and fantasy sports, or the chance element, lies in a different spot, right? The chance element, as you said, the fantasy sport lies in the playing out. Once you've set your lineups, once you've done the draft, it's out of your hands. There's nothing you can do. Once the games start, there's nothing you can do. You can't change your lineup. You can't go to the waiver wire. You're done for that week, and it's just how it's going to play out. Right. Where in poker, the chance element is in the beginning. It's in the setup. And then once you get the hand, then it's all about playing the cards, playing the players that you're playing, and reading them, and how you bet and gamble within that context. And so I don't play poker, but my understanding is that a good poker player can really win with almost any kind of hand, because they're not so much playing the cards that they have, but they're playing the other people that they're playing, if that makes sense. And so that's where it's not a luck issue at that point. It's an issue about skill. It's an issue about psychology. It's an issue about knowing what can win in that situation. So I like that difference, that differentiation there between the setup and the playing out.
Yeah, I think it's an important distinction. The other one that I make that I think is important to think about is, and this is Dennis Hemphill has written an article on cyber sports, and the fact that if we're going to say have a video game that is a sport video game, in which you are manipulating the controller in some sense, or if it's a Wii game where your movements are mm-hmm. being translated into a cyberspace or a virtual world, that there's a type of agency there that you can become a cyber athlete, so to speak, right. Because you're getting good at that game, right? Or so you're becoming a good cyber gamer, whatever you want to call it. And I think that there's an element there that translates into poker or fantasy football. That's important, probably. It maybe not be so much, clearly in the cyber games, you have agency throughout the entire event or mm-hmm. activity, which you don't in fantasy football or poker. But I think that's where if we're going to look at games on a continuum, those two types of games are fairly similar in some sense.
Right. And
fantasy football is not, you're not playing football. You don't have agency throughout. Further, it's not spectatorship where you don't have any agency. Mm-hmm. It's in the middle there. And I think that's part of what we what has made it so popular is we love watching football, and now we have a step towards being in football, being able to participate in football. We are participating in football through our fantasy ownership.
Yeah, it's definitely much more of an active activity. That's kind of an odd way to put it, but right. So the spectatorship of just sitting there watching a game is passive. You're sitting there, or as in my case, pacing around, but there's nothing you can do. You're completely cut off. All you're doing is taking in what happens and reacting. Where fantasy, once you've set your lineups, you're like that, but in the build-up, you feel at least that you're doing something. You're thinking about looking at the waiver wires. Is there anybody available? Is this guy better than the guy I have? Should I cut him? What's the risk in that? Should I start this guy or not? I mean, that's, I've been toying around for days now between two wide receivers about whether or not I should start. Is it Vincent Jackson and then Kenny? Got a couple Kennys, and so I forget which one it is, but the guy from San Diego, I think Keenan Allen. So I'm trying to decide between them and looking at, and I don't know. I think it's a toss-up, and I'm sure I'll choose wrong. But, but I feel more actively engaged in the process, which I think is important, certainly when we start talking about the psychological responses and how we acquire or experience ourselves in the world and achieve flourishing or have aspects of flourishing. You have to be active and engaged in the process. And I think fantasy allows you to at least have some measure of that in terms of something that you already enjoy from other perspectives.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think that's a big part of it. I think this gets to the crux of the issue that really what fantasy is. It's a parasitic game. It is playing on all that we love about football, at least over the past 20 or 30 years, as football has become a little bit more sensationalized, a little bit more entertaining, a little bit more of an individualistic type of sport. We've been able to take those elements that we like that are fairly new and harness those into our own game where we can, grow we feel like we're growing as football fans by becoming virtual owners. That's a fun thing.
Yeah. And I think it's a good way to learn about the game too. I mean, I haven't done fantasy baseball. I don't know if you've done fantasy baseball. Have you ever done fantasy baseball?
No, I did fantasy basketball 1 year.
Yeah.
That was difficult.
Yeah, well, I think, baseball is such a long season. Basketball is a pretty long season. There's so many in-week games. It seems like a much more complicated, more intensive thing. But I've also been attracted to doing it just because I want to learn more about sort of as an experiment, just learn more about it, but also just to learn more. I mean, I know a lot about the Red Sox, but I don't really know a lot about other teams. And I feel like fantasy would really help me learn more about that. And then I've also thought about doing it for the English Premier League because that's something I've been trying to get into. I've watched a lot of games this year because it's been on NBC. I'm really trying to develop my understanding and interest in soccer. I enjoy it when I watch the games. I do enjoy it, so it's not just a sort of I don't know, like soccer. Some people think of soccer now as in the U.S. as a kind of hipster thing, and so for me, it's not that. It's when the World Cup first came around back in the 90s, I was interested in it. I've always tried to get into it because I'm just interested in it. When I've seen good games, I've really enjoyed it. And I feel like I just need something more to tie me in. And so I think fantasy might do that. So at some point I want to do that. I still don't know enough about it that I'd be completely ignorant, of it. But I feel like it would be a way to learn about the different players, what they're doing. And I mean, I'm sure it'd be terrible at first, but I think it would give me something to, a rooting interest, but also a way to follow the sport better.
Absolutely. Certainly, it gives you, it forces you to stay involved in the day-to-day, the day-to-day statistics of the leagues, the day-to-day action. I think that the Premier League might lend itself a little bit easier than baseball or basketball does, because the nature of the season is that their games are fairly serial, much like football is, where you play one midweek game and then one weekend game and one midweek and one weekend, and that goes on and on like that. Football has been easy to follow in terms of fantasy because you know the game's on the weekend.
Right.
And you have all week to prepare, whereas basketball or baseball, boy, does that mean I got to change my lineup every single day or every other day? I just don't know if I can do that. It doesn't seem as clear-cut, at least the schedule and the rhythm of the season doesn't seem as clear-cut as what football is.
Well, you're stuck for the whole week with somebody because you do it, if you do it week by week, then you're stuck the whole week and you can't do the changes if something happens. And so it's,
yes, exactly.
Yeah, so and definitely more of an investment.
Exactly, sure is.
So we're coming up to the end here. Running out of time. Was there any other things you wanted to focus on, or any other key points about fantasy and its the intellectual philosophical issues there?
Well, I think this is a discussion that I hope will continue, and I will say I had a lot of fun writing this paper, especially the metaphysical part, and that's probably more my area of focus in terms of philosophy, anyways. But I think we need to keep discussing the ethics of fantasy sports and really what is it doing and what do we want? What are the social implications of high rate participation in, say, fantasy football? Mm-hmm. My inklings, and I alluded to this in the article, were that it's probably overall, if we're gonna make a ledger sheet, it's going to be overall maybe a little bit negative because I think of the individualism, because we're overlooking certain key elements that really make the game what it is, that will we're taking out any sort of intangible, and there are a lot of intangibles in football in terms of teamwork, in terms of blocking schemes, in terms of coverage. I think we're missing out on a lot of those things. I think what we're doing is essentially watering down football in a sense. Now, that's helpful for many different reasons. It can be good to water things down. So as you talk about trying to get into soccer more, being a fantasy international football owner, I think would help you understand the game. But at some point in time, you would hope that the owner, the fan, would be able to gain greater depth, greater insight into the nuances of the sport beyond just the basic statistics that matter to a fantasy owner. And I think potentially fantasy sports could be able to capture that as they become continually more complex, as they have been over the last few years.
Right.
But there's still a difficulty in being able to fully understand the game through fantasy, and in being able to take a step back from your fantasy ownership to be able to understand that the fantasy games are parasitic, they are derivative, they change the way we understand the game based on our pre-fantasy fanaticism. So I think that there's some real worries there if we continue to focus on, say, in Sports Illustrated, now they have this fantasy analysis every week, and if that comes to overtake the actual sports reporting that they do, that magazine, I think that would be a bad sign, or a sign that maybe we've become more interested in fantasy football as a sport that we could call Fantasy A for all we care, because it's different enough from football that it's not football.
I see.
And we think of fantasy as football.
Yeah, I mean that's a potential outcome that could be negative, and so certainly there's a lot more work for philosophers of sport like you and me, which is good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Job creation, so it's good.
Yeah.
All right, Chad, thanks for joining us today.
Sure. Thanks, Shawn, for having me. This is terrific. This has been a blast.
This has been the Sports Ethicist Show. You can find us at sportsethicist.com, Facebook, and Twitter, and you can email the show at sportsethicist@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.